The sun was high above the prairie, and I had just finished my work when I heard a loud crash from the barn. I froze. There was someone inside. I rushed toward the noise, breathing heavily, my heart pounding. Peeking through the crack in the door, I saw them 3 men in black, rummaging through my priceless antique collection. And standing among them, grinning as if she owned the place, was Karen. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I snapped, my voice cutting through the air. One of the men cursed and grabbed a handful of jewelry, stuffing it into his bag. Karen stepped forward. "You shouldn't have come here at this hour." Before I could react, chaos erupted. My emus, those usually calm, quirky creatures, charged into the barn, sensing my anger. They lunged at the thieves, pecking and knocking them down with brutal precision. I heard their screams. Karen got caught in the middle of it all. "Help, get them off me!" she screamed, but it was too late. The emus pecked at her, tearing her clothes apart. Her hair was a mess, and she stumbled around in sheer panic. "Run, run," she yelled, but it only made things worse. The men and Karen were running in every direction, their clothes torn, hair wild as the emus relentlessly pecked at their heels. One of the men tripped, falling, face first into the dirt, his bag spilling open. "This isn't over," Karen shouted, but as the emus moved in again, she realized she had made a fatal mistake. Karen was the kind of woman who entered a room like she owned it, and most of the time she did. Her impeccable red suit and matching high heels were the first things you'd notice, the color so bold, it almost screamed for attention. She walked with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance, each step calculated to assert her dominance. It wasn't just the way she dressed or carried herself, it was the way she expected the world to bend to her will. She held the position of president in the Homeowners Association, HOA, a role she wielded with the kind of power that most people would envy. To Karen, being in charge wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about controlling the lives of others, making them dance to her tune. In her eyes, she was the authority figure that everyone needed to obey, and anyone who dared challenge her would feel the full weight of her wrath. Her personality matched her position perfectly, cold, calculating, and relentless. Arrogance was Karen's most prominent trait. She walked into every conversation with the belief that she knew better than everyone else, that she was entitled to make decisions for those around her. She didn't simply ask for compliance, she demanded it. And when people didn't comply, she used manipulation to get what she wanted. She was a master of deception, expertly weaving stories and half-truths that made others believe her lies. She used fear as her most effective tool, knowing how to exploit the vulnerabilities of those who might question her power. Karen's manipulative nature extended beyond mere words. She had no qualms about using her position to ruin those who stood in her way. People trusted her, feared her, and were often too intimidated to oppose her. She never showed any real empathy for anyone. To her, everyone was just a pawn in her game. If someone didn't fit into her vision, they were disposable, easily discarded without a second thought. Her actions spoke louder than her words ever could. But there was something even darker behind Karen's polished exterior. Beneath the veneer of a well-respected community leader, she was deeply involved in illicit activities. Karen wasn't just an ordinary HOA president, she was the mastermind behind a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond the reach of the neighborhood she controlled. She had her hands in everything from smuggling valuable antiques to orchestrating the destruction of properties that didn't fit her plans. She wasn't content with just manipulating people. She had a long-term goal of controlling wealth and land. The people who dared to stand against her didn't just face social consequences, they faced financial ruin, intimidation, and even destruction. Karen's connection to the underground organization wasn't something anyone knew about until now. She was a key player in a network that took advantage of vulnerable homeowners, using their fear and ignorance to further her own wealth and influence. What started as a simple power play in the HOA had evolved into a sophisticated criminal operation, and the protagonist, unfortunately, was now squarely in her crosshairs. It was a normal day on the farm until it wasn't. I had just finished tending to the herd and was heading back to the barn when I noticed something strange. A faint sound, a rustling coming from the storage shed. I paused, trying to discern what it was. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the closer I got, the more it became clear someone was inside. I crept quietly toward the barn, keeping low the familiar smell of hay and the cool breeze, doing nothing to mask the sudden tension creeping up my spine. As I peered around the corner, I saw them. 3 men dressed in black, their faces masked. They were rummaging through my prized collection of antiques, pulling out anything of value: vintage jewelry, rare pocket watches, old weapons, and priceless works of art. It was happening just like that, a heist right under my nose. My fists clenched in anger. These weren't ordinary thieves. I knew this collection like the back of my hand. These were items passed down through generations, things I'd worked a lifetime to preserve, and now they were in the hands of strangers, thrown carelessly into bags. But the more I watched, the more I realized this was no random burglary. There was something methodical about their movements, something organized. One of the men kept glancing over at the others, nodding toward the heavy crates containing rare sculptures and weapons. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Then I saw her, Karen. The one person I never thought would be here, but the one person I knew could be behind this. She was standing at the front watching the men work, with a smirk on her face. Her posture was too calm, too confident. She wasn't just an observer, she was in charge. It all clicked. Karen had orchestrated this entire thing. She wasn't just after my antiques, she was taking everything systematically as part of a larger plan to weaken me and take control of this land. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make a sound. My heart raced as the pieces began to fit together. This wasn't just about stealing, it was about destroying everything I had worked for. Karen had sent these men to take what she could sell and to leave nothing but chaos behind. But this wasn't just a robbery. This was a calculated move, an attempt to undermine the very heart of this land. I stayed hidden, watching their every move. The more I saw, the angrier I became. But I knew I had to stay calm, not make a rash move. I had to think. How could I stop them without giving away my position? They were too close to the items, too far ahead of me, but I couldn't let them take everything. The adrenaline coursed through me as I watched the thieves work. I had to act fast. There were too many of them, and Karen was clearly the mastermind behind this. I couldn't confront them head-on, but I wasn't going to let them walk away with everything either. They had no idea I was there, but that wouldn't last for long. My mind raced, looking for the perfect way to outsmart them. I needed a distraction, something to pull their attention away from the treasures they were looting. I glanced around quickly and spotted what I needed, a crate of old farm equipment in the corner piled up high with rusty tools. If I could make that fall, it would create enough noise to pull them in the opposite direction. I took a deep breath, then quietly maneuvered behind the crate. One wrong move, and I'd give myself away. I pushed the crate slightly, just enough so that when it tipped over, it crashed loudly to the floor. The thieves froze. One of them, a tall man with a scruffy beard, turned sharply toward the noise. "What was that?" he hissed, his voice tense with suspicion. The others stopped mid-motion, instinctively turning toward the sound. I saw my chance. I moved fast, ducking behind a stack of old barrels. I could hear the thieves murmuring to each other, wondering if they'd been spotted. They took the bait and moved away from the valuables, heading toward the sound of the crash. But Karen, still calm as ever, stayed at the center, her eyes scanning the room, perhaps sensing something wasn't right. I watched her carefully. She was too focused on the theft to notice I was behind them, staying out of sight. But I knew this was my moment to act. I couldn't risk them escaping with everything. I needed to move quickly, so I darted forward, heading straight for the old barn doors. The thieves were too distracted to notice, and I was almost to the door when I heard a shout. "Hey, someone's here!" one of them yelled. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to see the man with the scruffy beard pointing directly at me. "Get him!" he shouted, and within seconds the thieves were on their feet, rushing toward me. But I was already on the move. I sprinted toward the far side of the barn, the sound of their footsteps hot on my heels. I knew this barn like the back of my hand, and I had a plan. I quickly darted into a narrow passageway, hoping the thieves were too clumsy to follow me there. I could hear them behind me, but their heavy boots pounding the floor told me I had a good head start. I couldn't afford to make a single mistake. I had to outthink them, outmaneuver them, and hope the emus would be able to cover me when the time came. But even as I rounded a corner, I knew that the stakes had just been raised. They weren't just after my antiques, they were after something more. The look in Karen's eyes as she called for the men to chase me confirmed it. This wasn't just about a robbery. This was part of something much bigger. I barely had time to catch my breath before the first of the thieves was on me again. He lunged at me, and I sidestepped narrowly, avoiding his grasp. As I shoved him away, I saw Karen standing at the entrance of the barn, her face a mask of calm determination. "You think you can stop us?" she sneered, taking a step forward. I was stunned for a second. She wasn't even fazed. "This is bigger than just you, you know," she continued, her voice cold and calculating. "You don't know what you're dealing with." I clenched my jaw, realizing the truth of her words. She had planned this for too long. I wasn't just defending my property. I was standing in the way of something far more dangerous. And as the other thieves closed in, I knew the only way to stop her was to expose her for what she was, no matter the cost. The time for games was over. It was time to fight back. But as I stood there, realizing the true depth of her manipulation, I knew this confrontation was just the beginning. The situation was quickly spiraling out of control. I could hear the thieves moving swiftly from one section of the barn to another, their hands grabbing anything of value. But it wasn't just the priceless antiques or the glistening jewelry that caught my attention. It was the way they handled everything as if it were nothing more than a simple transaction. For them, these items were just objects. For me, they were irreplaceable treasures, symbols of my family's history of years spent preserving pieces of the past. The first item they snatched was my great-grandfather's pocket watch. It had been passed down through 4 generations, each engraving, marking an important moment in our family's history. I watched helpless as one of the thieves carelessly tossed it into a bag, not even bothering to look at its intricate design. The faint click of the clasp closing on the bag seemed to echo in my chest. I moved closer, hidden behind a stack of crates, but I could see everything clearly. The men were now focusing on the corner where I kept my collection of rare sculptures, the ones my late father had painstakingly acquired over the years. Each piece had its own story, each one a memory of a time long past when my family was still whole. I could see them reaching for the sculptures, shoving them into sacks with no regard for their fragility. One of the men dropped a small bust of my great-grandmother, a piece so delicate that it cracked when it hit the floor. I could barely breathe. These weren't just things to me. They were fragments of a life I'd worked to build, preserved as a way of holding on to my past. Each item stolen wasn't just a loss of wealth, it was a loss of who I was, a loss of everything I had fought for. My blood began to boil. I had to do something, but my options were running out. Then I noticed something that made my heart stop. A large crate filled with valuable vintage stamps, some of the rarest in the world, all of which I had collected over the years. These weren't just stamps. They were a record of the past, a history of this land and its people. And yet there they were, being tossed aside like they were worthless. One of the thieves was carefully going through the box, selecting the ones he thought would fetch the highest price, oblivious to the significance they held. As they continued to raid my collection, it became painfully clear that this wasn't just a random theft. Karen's involvement in this was no accident. The way she had orchestrated everything, the way the thieves seemed to know exactly what to take, it wasn't just about money. They were targeting everything that held, meaning everything that connected me to my history, to my family. I felt the pit of despair in my stomach. But then, as the thieves continued their work, I began to piece together the bigger picture. This wasn't just about stealing for profit. It was about Karen taking control of what I had. Her plan wasn't to just rob me, it was to erase everything I had built, everything my family had worked for. These items weren't just going to disappear into the black market. Karen and her crew were planning to sell them to an underground network, to smugglers who would strip the land of its history for quick profit. I felt the weight of the realization crash over me. She wasn't just after my possessions, she was after my legacy, my identity. Everything I had worked to preserve for years was slipping through my fingers, being reduced to mere commodities in the hands of criminals. I stood frozen for a moment, watching them take everything that had meaning. The antique weapons from my grandfather's collection, the rare coins I had inherited, and even the delicate porcelain figurines I had displayed in the living room, all were gone in seconds. These were more than just things to me. They were the link to the past, to the roots that had grounded my family for generations. Without them, who was I? As the thieves began to gather their loot, Karen stood back, her face a mask of satisfaction. She had orchestrated it all. I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't just a heist. This was an attack on everything I had built. And now, standing there watching her grin, as my life was being dismantled, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let her get away with it. The barn was a cacophony of chaos. The emus, typically calm creatures, had become a blur of movement, charging straight at the thieves. The moment they burst through the door, I saw the panic flood their faces, but it was too late. These birds were fast, and they were angry. The first thief barely had time to shout before one of the emus slammed into him with such force that he was thrown to the ground, his bag of stolen jewels spilling onto the dirt floor. "Holy hell!" one of the men screamed, his voice thick with terror. He scrambled to his feet, trying to get away, but the emus were relentless. They surrounded him, their beaks snapping at his legs, pushing him back into the corner of the barn. The man tried to shield himself with his arms, but the birds didn't care. Their talons were sharp, and their beaks didn't hesitate to strike. The second thief, a stocky man with a thick mustache, didn't fare much better. He attempted to flee, but the emus chased him down, their long, powerful legs, closing the distance with ease. He tripped over a pile of old crates, and before he could get back up, one of the birds pecked at him, forcing him to roll into a heap on the floor. "Get off me," he yelled, kicking at the bird, but it wasn't interested in his pleas. The emu took another step forward, pushing its beak closer to his face, forcing him to scramble backwards in a panic. It was chaos. The barn was filled with a cloud of dust feathers flying in every direction as the emus attacked with precision. The third thief, a lanky man with greasy hair, tried to make a break for it. His eyes were wide with fear, and his breath came in short gasps as he bolted for the barn doors. He had almost made it, but in his desperation he failed to notice the second emu charging toward him. The bird slammed into his back, knocking him forward into the dirt. "No," he screamed, but the emu was already on top of him, pecking furiously at his legs, forcing him to stay down. It was then that I saw Karen. Standing at the far side of the barn, she had barely moved from her position. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment there was nothing but fury in her gaze. She had orchestrated all of this, the theft, the destruction, and now this utter chaos. She was no longer the confident woman who had walked into my barn earlier. Her red suit was covered in dirt and torn in places, and her heels, usually so polished and poised, were now scuffed and broken. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. Instead, she stood there, staring at the scene unfolding before her, with a look of disbelief on her face. "What are you doing?" she shouted, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "Stop! Get away from them!" But the emus didn't care for her commands. They were on a mission, and their target was clear. They weren't stopping until every last one of these thieves was out of my barn. "Help me," she screamed again, but this time her voice cracked. She stumbled backwards, trying to escape the madness, but the birds were relentless. One emu charged directly at her, its long legs stretching forward, and before she could react, it knocked her off her feet. Her red suit was torn even further as she hit the ground hard, dust clouding the air around her. I could see the panic set in. Karen, the mastermind, the one who had planned this entire operation, was now at the mercy of the creatures she had no control over. Her once confident demeanor had evaporated, replaced by a woman who was now struggling to stay on her feet as an emu pecked at her heels. She tried to scramble away, but the emus were quick to catch up, her movements too slow to outrun them. The thieves, once so confident and calculating, were now in full flight. They were running in every direction, shouting at each other, their panic rising with every step. The men had left behind bags full of stolen goods as they fled, their shoes slipping on the dirt floor, their clothes ripped and torn by the furious emus. I watched as one of them ran toward the barn doors, but just as he thought he was in the clear, an emu darted forward, blocking his path. The man tried to push the bird out of the way, but the emu lunged at him, pecking him on the arm and sending him tumbling backward. The thief let out a desperate cry, but it was no use. He was trapped. Karen was caught in the crossfire. She pushed herself up from the ground, her hands covered in dirt, and tried to regain some semblance of composure, but it was clear she was losing control. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she shouted, stumbling away from the emus as they closed in on her again. She reached for her phone, trying to call for help, but one of the emus darted forward, pecking at her wrist, knocking the phone from her hand. She screamed, looking around for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. Her control over the situation had completely unraveled. As the emus continued their attack, the men who had once been so eager to steal from me now found themselves on the defensive. One of the thieves tripped over a stack of wooden crates, falling face first into the dirt. The stolen goods that had been so carefully packed away spilled out onto the floor, forgotten in the chaos. The bags lay abandoned, their contents now scattered around the barn. Gold, jewelry, rare antiques, and precious artifacts all left behind as the thieves ran for their lives, their every attempt to escape thwarted by the emus. The entire scene was like something out of a nightmare. It was clear that Karen hadn't anticipated anything like this. She had thought she was in control, but now she was just another victim of her own greed and arrogance. And as she stumbled around trying to dodge the emus and gather herself, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. My farm, once vulnerable to the manipulative schemes of people like Karen, was now protected in a way no one could have predicted. The emus had taken control, and in doing so had saved everything I had fought so hard to preserve. "Please stop them," Karen begged, her voice breaking as she glanced over at the retreating thieves. She looked at me, her face a picture of humiliation and desperation. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll regret this." But I wasn't listening anymore. I had already seen the real Karen, the one behind the theft, the one who had tried to tear my world apart. She had underestimated me, and now she was paying the price for it. The chaos slowly began to subside as the last of the thieves disappeared into the distance, but the damage had already been done. The stolen goods were left behind, scattered across the barn floor, and Karen was left standing in the middle of it all, a picture of defeat. The barn had fallen silent, the only sound left being the distant clucking of the emus as they wandered back to the field. The chaos had reached its peak, and now all that remained was the aftermath. But Karen wasn't ready to accept defeat. She was still standing there, looking around frantically, her hands trembling, her face flushed with panic. She tried to compose herself, but it was clear that she had no control over the situation anymore. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking as she stepped toward me. Her usual confidence had completely evaporated. This was necessary. "You don't know what you're dealing with." I crossed my arms watching her as she took a few steps forward, her red suit now dirty and torn. "Necessary? You sent men to rob me, to steal everything I've worked for." "How is that necessary, Karen?" My voice was calm, but my anger was seeping through. She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. "Don't bother trying to lie your way out of this. It's over." Karen's eyes flickered nervously as she glanced around, as if searching for an escape route, but there was nowhere to run. She took another step toward me, and I could see her mind working, calculating her next move. "You think this is over?" she said, her tone now almost pleading. "I have connections. You don't know who you're messing with. I was just trying to help you, but you had to resist. You left me no choice." I couldn't help but scoff at her words. "Help me? You were taking everything from me, Karen. The only person you were helping was yourself, and you were using me as a pawn." She shook her head, her eyes wild. "No, you don't understand. This was bigger than just you. I had no choice but to do this. Do you think I wanted to go this far? I'm part of something much bigger, something you'll never understand. You've been nothing but a roadblock to progress." I raised an eyebrow, the anger inside me bubbling up. "A roadblock? Is that what you call destroying someone's life? You think you can just walk in here and take whatever you want?" Karen's face twisted with frustration as she took another step closer. "I wasn't trying to destroy your life. I was trying to save it. You just didn't see it. I was going to take everything from you and give it to the right people. I was going to get it to the right hands." I stood up straighter, my fists clenching. "The right people? You were selling my family's legacy to criminals, Karen. Those items weren't just worth money. They were my history, my heritage, and you were going to wipe it all away for a quick profit." She froze for a moment, her eyes flashing with irritation. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she spat. But then she paused, a shift in her demeanor. She seemed to realize something, her expression faltering for the briefest of moments. I couldn't hold back any longer. "You made one huge mistake, Karen," I said, my voice cold. "You thought you were untouchable. But you didn't account for one thing." She narrowed her eyes, but I could see the unease creeping in. "What mistake?" she asked, her voice suddenly much smaller than before. I smiled grimly. "The cameras." Her face paled as she realized what I was talking about. Cameras. What I pulled my phone out of my pocket, showing her the footage I had recorded from the security cameras I had installed around the barn. The footage was clear. Karen had led the thieves in coordinating every move, every theft, like a director on a film set. The cameras had captured it all, her orders, the men loading up the stolen goods, and her smiling face as she watched the whole operation unfold. Karen's breath caught in her throat as she saw the evidence, her mind scrambling for an excuse. You don't understand. That's not," I raised a hand to silence her. "I don't need to understand. The police are already on their way, and when they get here, I'll show them everything. You won't be able to talk your way out of this, Karen." Her expression shifted from desperation to anger, the mask she'd worn for so long crumbling away. "You think you can just call the police and everything will be fine," she hissed, her voice venomous. "This is nothing. You're nothing." I stood my ground. "You're right about one thing. I'm nothing like you." Her eyes blazed with fury. "You don't know what you've started," she snarled, her voice low. "I'm just a small part of something much bigger than you can ever comprehend. Do you think calling the police will stop this? Do you think you've won? There are people who will come for you, people who don't care about your petty farm and your little life. You have no idea what you're up against." I wasn't fazed by her words. I had heard her threats before, but now they only served to solidify the truth. She wasn't just some petty criminal. She was part of something much larger, something dangerous. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was that I had the evidence, and Karen had no more cards to play. At that moment, I heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. My heart raced, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the satisfaction of knowing that justice was finally coming. The truth would come out. This nightmare would end. I turned to Karen, my voice steady. "You're finished. It's over." She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat as the police cars screeched to a halt outside. Deputies rushed into the barn, and within seconds they had surrounded Karen and her crew. It was over. Karen and the thieves were arrested, their plans exposed for the world to see. The moment the police arrived, everything changed. The barn, once a place of quiet labor, now echoed with the tension of the situation unraveling. Karen stood there, surrounded by the men she had enlisted to rob me, her eyes darting from side to side as the deputies approached. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, shocked, but not yet willing to admit defeat. Her entire life, built on lies and manipulation, was crumbling before her eyes, and she could do nothing to stop it. I stood a few feet away, my arms crossed, watching her every move. The truth was already out exposed by the cameras I had so carefully installed. I had watched Karen orchestrate the entire theft, watched her direct her men to steal from my family, my history. Now, she was standing in front of the law, and there was nowhere for her to hide. A sheriff's deputy approached Karen, his voice stern as he addressed her. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for conspiracy theft and multiple other charges. You have the right to remain silent." Karen's face twisted with frustration, her eyes narrowing as she took a step toward the deputy. "This is ridiculous," she spat, her voice trembling with anger. "You don't understand. This isn't what it seems. I was just doing what was necessary. I was trying to help this place." I watched her struggle to keep her composure. She was trying to hold on to the scraps of control she had left, but it was clear that her attempts to manipulate the situation were failing. The sheriff didn't flinch at her words. "Help, you hired criminals to steal from someone you were supposed to work with, Karen," he replied coldly. "This isn't about helping anyone. This is about greed and power." Karen's gaze snapped to me, her voice rising. "You don't know what you're talking about," she shouted, taking a step back, as if trying to retreat into the chaos of the barn. "I did this because you wouldn't listen. You were never going to give in, and I had to make things right. You can't just keep hiding behind your legacy." I stepped forward, my voice steady as I confronted her. "You call this making things right? You nearly destroyed my life, Karen. Those antiques, those pieces of history, they weren't just things to me. They were my family's legacy, and you thought you could just take them for yourself." Her expression faltered for a moment, the smugness on her face replaced with something else, desperation. She looked around hoping for some kind of escape, but the walls were closing in on her. The police had already secured the area, and her criminal network was crumbling. No, you don't understand," she continued, her voice rising in pitch as her frustration grew. "I needed them. I had to get those things out of here. You have no idea what I've had to deal with. You think this is about money. It's not. This is about power control. You think I can just let you keep everything you've worked for? Without consequences, I was saving this place." Her words were frantic, now a jumble of justifications and excuses that no longer held weight. The more she spoke, the more she sounded like a woman trying to convince herself she was still in control. But there was no control left. Her web of lies was coming apart piece by piece, and she knew it. The deputy nodded toward the camera that had caught every moment of her crime. "We've seen the footage, Karen. We know what you did, and you're not getting away with it." Karen's face turned pale. She had no more words, no more excuses. All her carefully crafted lies had been exposed, and now she was left standing in front of the law, her plans shattered. The sheriff gave me a brief nod, acknowledging that the situation was coming to a close. "We'll take it from here," he said, signaling to his deputies to cuff Karen and her accomplices. The reality of it all hit me in that moment. I had fought to protect my family's legacy, and now the truth had come to light. Karen had been a predator, but she was no longer in control. The stolen items, the deceit, and the manipulation, it was all coming to an end. The community would know the truth, and Karen would face the consequences of her actions. As the deputies led her away, Karen shot one last venomous glare at me. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice, a final threat. But I stood there unshaken, knowing that justice had finally been served. The barn was eerily quiet now, the air thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Karen stood in silence, her hands cuffed behind her back as she stared at the ground, the full scope of her plan slowly sinking in. But it wasn't over. The truth wasn't just going to stop with her arrest. The real proof of her criminal activities was about to be exposed, and the evidence was clear. As the deputies began their investigation, I could see the weight of the evidence pile up. They combed through the bags the thieves had dropped in their frantic retreat, finding the stolen items that had once been part of my family's legacy: rare coins, jewelry, antique pocket watches, and delicate works of art. But there was more to this than just a few stolen objects. The police had discovered something even darker, buried within the chaos documents. One of the deputies held up a folder, the papers inside spilling onto the table. "Take a look at this," he said, turning to me with a grim expression. The documents were counterfeit. They were all carefully forged contracts, fake receipts, and fraudulent ownership papers for the items Karen had been planning to sell. But the real kicker was the connections they revealed. My heart sank as I looked over the paperwork. These weren't just random documents, they were the work of a well-organized criminal network. Karen had been dealing with underground smugglers, selling my family's priceless heirlooms to the highest bidder. The receipts showed not only transactions with various illicit buyers, but also the distribution of the stolen goods to shadowy organizations. Some of these buyers were notorious for trafficking in stolen art, weapons, and antiquities. Karen had sold off the items not to collectors, but to criminals, people who would melt down gold, erase any identifying marks, and turn history into cash. I turned to Karen, a sick feeling twisting in my stomach. She was still standing there, her eyes wild with disbelief, but she knew it was over. She knew the game had ended, and there was no more room for lies. "You see, Karen," I said quietly, "it wasn't just about the money, was it? You weren't just trying to make a profit off my family's history. You were involved with a criminal syndicate. You sold my father's legacy to people who destroy these treasures for a living." She didn't respond. She couldn't. There was nothing left to say. The police had the receipts, the forged documents, the smuggler connections, everything that tied her directly to a network of criminal activities. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no way to escape the gravity of it. The deputies moved swiftly, securing the documents and taking photographs of everything for evidence. As they did, Karen's accomplices were being interrogated in the corner of the barn. They had been so sure of their success, so confident that they could get away with it. But now, one by one, they were breaking down. The first thief, the one with the thick mustache, was the first to crack. "I didn't know it would go this far," he mumbled, his voice shaky. "Karen said it was just a job, just taking stuff from a place that didn't matter. She promised us money a way out." He paused, glancing nervously at Karen, who had remained stone-faced. "But we didn't know she was selling it to those people. We didn't know who they were. We thought it was just some rich guy's collection. But it's worse, isn't it?" The sheriff nodded, taking note of the man's confession. "It's a lot worse. You're looking at charges for conspiracy, theft, trafficking, and stolen goods. You'll be lucky to get a plea deal." Another accomplice, the lanky man who had tried to escape earlier, quickly followed suit. She said it was easy. "We just take what we need, get paid, and walk away." But when we saw what she was really doing, we realized it was a lot deeper than we thought. She told us to stay quiet, not to ask questions. As they spoke, I could see Karen's eyes shifting. She was no longer the confident mastermind she had been earlier. The truth was unraveling, and every word from her accomplices was a nail in her coffin. The reality of her situation was sinking in. She had used people, manipulated them into participating in a criminal enterprise. The last of her crew, a younger man with a nervous twitch, was the most reluctant. "I didn't know who I was working for. She said we'd take a few things, sell them off. But now I see it's a whole operation. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just needed the money." He hung his head in shame as the deputies processed the last of the statements. Karen's plan was falling apart, and there was no one left to shield her. The sheriff turned to me after they finished collecting everything. "It's clear now," he said with a somber look. "This wasn't just a random theft. This was an organized crime operation, and Karen was at the center of it all. We'll be working with federal agents to track the rest of the operation down. But for now, the evidence is overwhelming." I nodded, the weight of the situation slowly starting to settle in. Karen hadn't just stolen from me. She had been part of a much larger network, and the stolen artifacts were only a small part of the operation. Her greed had led her down a path that now stretched across multiple states, with deep connections to criminal groups who specialized in art theft, smuggling, and trafficking. But the truth was out, and it wasn't going away. As Karen was led away, her face pale and her eyes filled with fury, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure. The thefts, the lies, the manipulation, they had all been exposed. And now it was time for justice. The barn was quiet now, except for the soft murmur of voices and the rustle of the officers moving about securing the last of the evidence. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of finality. Karen stood in the middle of it all, her hands bound behind her, her once confident stance reduced to a deflated shell. The very woman who had orchestrated this entire operation, who had plotted, lied, and manipulated, was now just another criminal caught in the web she had spun for herself. I watched her closely as she was led toward the squad car, her face pale and expressionless. The defiant smirk that had once defined her character was gone, replaced by something I hadn't seen before: fear. The sight of her being handcuffed and walked out of my barn was more satisfying than I had expected, yet it felt strangely anticlimactic. She had been a thorn in my side for far too long, and now finally the truth had come to light. Sheriff Miller was right beside me, his expression unreadable as he watched Karen's arrest unfold. The deputies had already taken her accomplices into custody, each one of them revealing more about her criminal activities than she had ever intended. The authorities were already working on the next steps, building the case against her, connecting her to the larger criminal network she had been running. But for now, it was the end of her reign. She was going down for good. "You did well," Sheriff Miller said, his voice low but appreciative. I nodded still, watching as Karen was shoved into the back of a patrol car. The sight of her being driven away felt almost surreal. All those nights of tension, all the sleepless hours spent wondering what she'd do next, it was finally over. The stolen artifacts, the damage she'd done to my family, and the betrayal I'd felt, all of it had led to this moment. Karen, now powerless, didn't even look at me. Her gaze was fixed on the ground, her jaw clenched in silent fury. She had tried to control everything, to manipulate everyone around her. But now, she was nothing. Just another criminal caught in the act, her plans unraveled. As the patrol car drove away, the small crowd that had gathered in the distance began to disperse. Some of the neighbors who had been affected by Karen's manipulations stood nearby, exchanging quiet words. I could feel the relief in the air, a community finally freed from the shadow of Karen's lies. "Is it really over?" one of the neighbors, Tom, asked me, his voice tinged with disbelief. I nodded. "It's over." The last piece of the puzzle had been put into place. The stolen items were being returned, the criminals arrested, and Karen's scheme exposed. Her elaborate facade of authority had crumbled, and the truth had emerged. She had wanted to control the valley, to manipulate people for her own gain. But in the end, her greed and arrogance had led her to underestimate the people she sought to dominate. I turned my attention back to the barn, where the deputies were finishing up their investigation. The stolen artifacts would be cataloged and returned, and Karen's criminal network would soon be dismantled. The truth had come to light, and there was no more room for her lies. Her downfall had been swift and absolute. As I stood there, a wave of exhaustion washed over me. I had fought so hard to protect what was mine, my family's legacy, my ranch, my community, and now, for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. It was hard to believe that it was finally over. In the distance, I could hear the faint sound of the emus, clucking softly, returning to the fields where they belonged. It was almost symbolic. The animals that had saved me, that had turned the tide in this battle, were now at rest. The ranch, my sanctuary, was safe once again. "She'll get what's coming to her," Sheriff Miller said as he walked over, breaking my thoughts. His voice was firm. "We've got enough evidence to make sure she's locked up for a long time." I nodded finally, allowing myself a breath of relief. I just never imagined it would end like this. "It never does," he said, with a quiet chuckle. "But justice always catches up eventually." As the sheriff walked away to finalize the paperwork, I stood there for a moment longer, looking out over the land I had fought so hard to protect. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the fields. It felt like a new beginning, a fresh start after all the turmoil. Karen's lies were exposed, and the weight of her manipulation was finally lifted. The valley was free. But one thing was clear: the fight for what was right never ends. And I would continue to stand guard, protecting this place and the people I loved from anyone who dared to threaten it again. As the chaos finally subsided, a deep sense of calm began to take over the valley. The tension that had hung in the air for so long seemed to dissolve, leaving behind a tranquility that felt both unfamiliar and comforting. The community, which had been so fractured and fearful during Karen's manipulation, slowly began to heal. People who had once been divided by suspicion and fear now came together, offering help where it was needed most. Neighbors who had been too wary to speak before were now sharing stories, extending invitations for dinners, and lending hands for repairs. It was as if Karen's grip on the valley had been shattered, and in the wake of her departure, the people found the strength to rebuild the trust that had been lost. We weren't just rebuilding fences and barns. We were rebuilding the very foundation of our community, one that had been tested and now stood stronger for it. I watched as people worked side by side, uniting to restore what had been damaged, not just in the land, but in the relationships that had been strained by Karen's lies. There was laughter again, the kind that felt genuine, not forced. The small acts of kindness and the willingness to stand together were what mattered most. It wasn't just about the physical repairs. It was about reclaiming the spirit of cooperation and mutual respect that had been the heartbeat of the valley. As for me, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I had stood my ground, fought for what was right, and in doing so, protected not only my family's legacy, but the future of this community. Watching them come together, I knew that it was all worth it. Peace had returned, and for the first time in a long while, I could breathe easy knowing that we were all safe. Karen's fall from grace was swift and unavoidable. The evidence against her was undeniable, and as the case progressed, the full scope of her criminal activities came to light. Along with her accomplices, she faced serious charges, including conspiracy theft, trafficking in stolen goods, and fraud. It wasn't long before she was sentenced, her actions laid bare for everyone to see. The punishment she received was just her attempts to manipulate and exploit the community had come at a heavy cost, and now the law had caught up with her. For the community, this was more than just a legal victory. It was a moment of liberation. The fear and mistrust that had plagued us for so long were finally gone. Karen's actions had threatened to tear apart the very fabric of our lives, but now with her conviction, we could begin to rebuild with a sense of justice and security. The entire experience served as a harsh lesson for all of us. We had learned just how vulnerable we were to deception and manipulation, how easy it was for someone to take advantage of our trust. But we had also learned how powerful the truth could be, and how important it was to stand together when facing threats. The community was stronger and wiser, and we would never forget the lessons we had learned from Karen's betrayal. In the aftermath of everything that had happened, something remarkable began to take shape. The valley, once divided by fear and suspicion, had become a united force. We were no longer just neighbors. We were a community bound by shared experience and a renewed sense of trust. The events that had nearly torn us apart had instead brought us closer together, forging bonds that were now stronger than ever. We were all more vigilant now, watching out for one another in ways we hadn't before. People spoke up when they saw something off, and we worked together to ensure that no one could exploit us again. The sense of solidarity was palpable in the air. We were determined to protect what we had built and ensure that something like Karen's scheme could never happen again. There was a quiet strength in the valley, now a sense of pride in our resilience. As for me, I could finally breathe easy again. I had fought for my family's legacy, and I had won. But more importantly, I had seen how a community, when united, could overcome even the darkest of threats. I knew that no matter what the future held, we were ready, and that gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The valley was safe again, and this time it was stronger than ever. Looking back, the win wasn't what mattered most. If I had let my emotions take the lead, if I had taken matters into my own hands, things would have played out very differently. I had every reason to be angry, to seek revenge for what Karen tried to do to my family, but I knew that the right path wasn't the one fueled by fury. It was the legal process, the evidence and the authorities that ultimately brought about justice, not vengeance. Standing up for what's right doesn't mean letting anger dictate your actions. It means following the rules, respecting the law, and allowing the justice system to do its work. Emotional escalation or violent retaliation would have only complicated things further, undermining everything I was trying to protect. Evidence, patience, and process were the tools that turned the tide. If there's anything I can share from my experience, it's this: always keep your records, stay informed, and never hesitate to reach out to the right authorities when the situation demands it. The law is there for a reason. Use it, don't fight against it. Communities stay strong when people respect the law and support one another. The HOA's power only exists when it's unchecked, and that's something we must all remember. As I stand here looking over the land I fought for, I know that the real victory is in the peace we've regained, the peace that comes from knowing we did things the right way.